Hydro, which was built in the mid-1980s, is actually a 28 megawatt facility. Significant power capacity. For the most part, these facilities are in place to ship peak power to Boston. That's when they run the hardest, is in the summer, shipping power out of state. Lewis and Auburn had an economy built on these facilities, and ultimately now, other than some property tax payments to Lewiston, that's the limit of the impact on local industry. This facility was just issued, as well as DRIPS, a 50-year license to operate on the river. And that's the history of negotiating with hydro facilities would make a fascinating future lecture. This is just a quick view. If you can make out the color shades, we overlaid the current map of the Androscoggin River with the historic topo. So the dark blue you see running along the center is the original river channel, and the light blue was sort of the fanning out of the river as it became a lake. And you can see on the upper side, or the west side of the river as it flows, the old river road. So places where the river road clearly went underwater, and places where it never did. I'll show some slides later. That area that's not underwater is actually the new state park in Turner. And you can still see sections where the road seems to go and then just sort of fall off into the river. So let's take a quick glance around New England and see what some other folks are up to and some of the history comparison. Lawrence is a good spot. We travel 495. This is a great clock tower you can easily view looking north. Looking out to the right if you're heading south on 495. A very interesting community. Of course, Lawrence and Lowell act more like Twin Cities, I guess, sort of like what Lewis and Auburn do, even though they're separated quite a bit, but there's a significant rivalry even today on redevelopment with respect to Lawrence. Lawrence's canals were dug for over about a 50-year period. That top one is actually an incorrect fact. It came up from a reference to another community that I'll get to in a second. Lawrence only had about a 5-foot drop in its river in the heart of the community. So they literally needed to build about a 25-foot dam to even create the potential to build facilities. So they literally had to manufacture the potential for a company town, an industrial town to be built. And then in turn to build a canal system as part of that. So over about that 50-year period, they built 2 canals. The North Canal, as it's referenced there, which had the potential for about 10,000 horsepower max, and a North Canal, South Canal, which had about 2,000 horsepower. That was the equivalent to about 35 mills. So their full build-out was about what Lewiston's minimum was in terms of power potential. Lawrence, for the most part, built out that full potential. As I mentioned, Lewiston ultimately never even built out the full 9,000, let alone the triple amount that was projected under proper management. Lawrence is going through an interesting transition. You have a couple of the master planning maps there as they look at how to build parks and even thread parks through their historic district as they try to redevelop and reposition themselves. Their big competition, as I mentioned a moment ago, is the city of Lowell, which benefited from significant federal investment led by the late Paul Songus. But there are a number of small heritage parks that have popped up, state park basis, and then trying to figure out how to use their canals. Lawrence right now does not have the potential to use their canals themselves for recreation. Lowell and Lewis and Auburn, Lewis in particular, often finds itself wanting to be compared to Lowell. It may be the envy of the finances. But Lowell was not actually originally built for industrial power, its canal system. The Pawtucket Falls were a significant drop in downtown Lowell. So for shipbuilding and transport of materials, they need to get around those falls. And do it in a simple, most least expensive way. If you look at the map, there's sort of a sweeping canal that comes south and then turns back north. That's the Pawtucket Canal. It actually rejoins at the Concord River, which is a very small tributary. Most people don't even know Lowell has a second river. The Concord River actually runs from south to north and meets the Merrimack. The Pawtucket Canal was built exclusively for transportation. It was a means in the 1790s to get around the falls and back in. When the opportunity emerged to actually plan out an industrial city, several tiers of canals were built, totaling about 5.6 miles, nearly 6-mile canal system. Lowell has the largest canal system by length in New England. And even then, the power system, the potential of the power there with the drop of the Pawtucket was only 10,000 horsepower. So again, looking at comparisons, Lewiston was pretty much in line with some of the bigger towns. Lowell, Lawrence, and many of the other communities, of course, had a much more significant head start on the city of Lewiston. A little bit more about Lowell. I've been fortunate. The Land Trust in Lowell, as well as city staff there, have invited my organization down on a number of occasions to look and learn a bit about how they do what they do, sort of projecting out how important the heritage of Lowell, the canal system, using their rivers for recreation, for arts, for history, for interpretive components, and how that could play out here. Certainly you've got similar partners, arts agencies, historic groups, you've got the National Park Service with a significant presence, and they've done a real great job looking at opportunities to interpret the landscape along the way and start to tell the story of their history with interpretive signage that's actually multilingual. Lowell's fortunate to have quite a diversity of immigrants that have come there, and a significant Hispanic population that's come in the last 10 to 20 years, but obviously had quite a history of in-migration during the textile era. Some of the more interesting things that Lowell's tried to figure out, getting outside the box. On the right-hand side, and actually I just got a message from them. They're planning a big weekend this weekend given the rainfall. During spring runoff, the Concord River actually has 3 sets of rapids, Class 3 and 2 Class 4s depending on flow. And they'll literally lead guided whitewater rafting trips in downtown Lowell, and those trips end in the canal system. They have volunteers that manage the locks. So the old transportation canal system had the locks. Those are still, they're owned by the National Park Service now, maintained by the Park Service, but actually operated by volunteers. And you can literally be out whitewater rafting in between rapids, learn a little bit about the history of Lowell as you paddle through Lowell, which is fascinating. To the left, the Songus Industrial History Center is a partnership with the historical groups as well as the University of Massachusetts Lowell. Integrating the higher education system as a research base, as a base for creating programming has been significant for Lowell in being able to keep their history alive actually through, there's a quick cut out there, an activity guide, Power to Production, actually creating classroom materials, curriculum-based materials where K through 12 classes can actually take lessons and do experiential learning and tie it right back to science-based education, math-based education, which I think is really the future of looking at a community's history, is how you integrate that into preparing a workforce and the citizens of the future. We're not going to go back to making the blankets and shoes or whatever a community made, but you can learn that ability to get out into the landscape. You can take that and project it forward. And there's a little shot of some folks coming into one of the lofts at a gatehouse. Holyoke. All right, Holyoke is the largest system of power canals. Holyoke's canal system was built exclusively for power. Lowell's system is longer in length by a little over a mile, but as I mentioned, the Pawtucket Canal was a sweeping transportation canal. In this case, the Holyoke system is exclusively power. Dug over about a 50-year period. I had the chance to visit Holyoke last year, and it's a very different canal system than Lewiston's, and you can really tell that the amount of attention that went into maximizing its power production. Our canal widths get up to 60 feet. That's the lower threshold. They get as wide as 140 feet. A real significant system. It's sort of rivers within the heart of the community. Their system was capable of up to 30,000 horsepower. It was designed for that. They got fairly close. It was a paper mill hub for North America and the world at the time. They had the equivalent power of 100 textile mills, which is a significant feat. and even really small communities, and so start the transition to sort of where we go projecting into the future. Turner's Falls in Montague, Massachusetts, a very small community sitting in northern central Massachusetts on the Connecticut River, has one small canal system and really one major mill, and they're really betting their economic future on how to redevelop that mill, use the canal, and tell the history of their community, predominantly through arts and creative industries. So that Turner Falls River Culture is a group that does everything from the history and cultural programming to arts, entertainment, and economic development, and a lot of community building along the way. But really looking at how you use those existing resources and cut across a host of silos that typically emerge. It's not one history group, one arts group, one economic development group. Most of the communities in Massachusetts that are looking at reusing these facilities have agencies that cut across a number of those, which I think makes them much more efficient and nimble. And the last, Lowell National Park, one city, Lawrence, redevelopment plans, one city, Turner's Falls, Montague, same. There are new models emerging because, as I mentioned earlier, Lewis and Auburn, it had its use of the river, but it actually impacted a bigger landscape all the way up to the headwaters with the acquisition of those upper dams and villages in Turner that were destroyed. This is a map of the Blackstone River Valley, which cuts through Massachusetts and Rhode Island. It's described as the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. The National Park Service, which manages national heritage areas, which this is. The designation is more for cachet and marketing than anything else. It doesn't come with the kind of money that Lowell got when it built its national park. But it really was about saying that this particular river valley had a story of national significance. And the way they still describe it is that the Blackstone River is America's hardest working river. I think there's a lot about the Androscoggin River today and how it evolved in the 20th century that actually makes the Androscoggin the hardest working river. I mentioned it being the most heavily managed. In my guesstimation, that also means it's the most, it's the hardest working of all of them. So where can we go? Where can we go from here to think about reharnessing the Androscoggin River? And I'll build quickly off the Blackstone dynamic. Is there anything about this river? What about this river makes it distinctive? As I walked through a number of them, Turner's Falls being probably the best example. Nearly every community in New England that had a river built mills. And nearly all of them that had rivers that built mills also tried to do canals. Is there anything about our story that makes it distinctive if we want to make it have a competitive advantage? If it's about economic development, luring visitors and investors, is there a story here that's important enough to draw attention? If there's not, that's fine. We can move on from there. If there is, we need to wrestle with finding out what that story is. Our organization is working right now with a number of organizations to look at really what the potential is to brand the corridor. Is there a brand? And brand may not be the ideal word to use. But besides being the most hardest working river right now in the country in terms of how it's managed, to being a river that was literally dead for a period of time because of industrial and municipal pollution. A river that gave rise to an Ed Muskie in Rumford, who then came to Bates College and then went off to the U.S. Senate, where he pushed through the Clean Water Act. There's a lot about this river telling the story of how this country rose up, industrialized, nearly destroyed much of our natural resources, and now this balance of how we try to reclaim, restore, and try to find that balance. There's a lot about the communities up and down this river that tell that story. Lewis and Auburn being the only cities in that corridor, that could put us in a very interesting position if that was a narrative we wanted to walk through. And what might that mean if we wanted to take an approach, even on a small scale, to what the Blackstone has done. There are a lot of things emerging right now that could open that door if this region wanted to pursue that and put our story on a national pedestal as opposed to simply a local. We've worked with a number of different stakeholders in the last couple of years. A report was rolled out by the New England Governors Conference. It's a coalition of the 6 New England governors that meet to talk about a host of issues: economic development, transportation, the environment. And they put together a work group to look at natural resources and were there opportunities of national significance that the governors could pursue together. And one of the recommendations that emerged was the potential to look at a national demonstration project for river heritage